Hey everyone! In this lesson we're going to look at and break down the chord progression for the lizards, and to help us understand what's really going on here, we'll focus in on three main concepts: chromaticism and Trey's use of the chromatic scale, chord inversions or the reordering of notes that make up a chord, and lastly, each note's intervallic relationship to all other notes. First, let's take a look at the verse and how the chord progression goes so we can get our bearings. We start off with a C, down to a G over B, to a C9 over B flat, to an F major 7 over A, F minor major 7 over A flat, 2 rounds of that, then down to a C over G, to F sharp half diminished, then a G9, to a G, I meant G major 9 there, down to a G9 over F, to an E7 sus 4, to an E7, and then we'll do a few more chords here. Then we just move the index up and it becomes F diminished. Now we move it up by a minor third to make it a G sharp diminished, which is really just the same thing, but inverted. More on that later. And then we come up to a B diminished. And what that does is perfectly sets up the transition back to a C, which will come as we do another round of that chord progression. Now, let's take a look at the chromatic scale and how Trey uses it throughout the verse. Now, if we take a look at the movement of just the bass note of each one of those chords, we'll see that there's this really beautiful chromatic movement from right to left, and I'm going to lay this out with just one finger so we can really see it clearly. We start on the 10th fret of the D string, that's the root of our C chord. Then we go down to a B. After that, there's going to be a B flat, an A, followed by an A flat, which happens for 2 rounds. Then down to a G, down to an F sharp, and then back up to a G. Now, the reason that I'm calling this note here F sharp rather than calling it G flat is because that chord that we end up playing, we end up picking it, but the chord is really at this half diminished chord, and really the way that I tend to think of or hear a half diminished chord or the mode of Locrian is just simply the first inversion of the 5th or the Mixolydian mode. So in our case, if I'm calling this F sharp half diminished, I'm thinking of that really as a D9 chord, which is the 5th of G, which is what the next chord is. So it's just kind of setting the ear up for that change. Let's look at just a couple different ways we can play the chromatic scale. It's probably the most uniform scale there is, because if we think about just like the major scale, for example, we're not really playing every note, we're skipping certain notes along the way. So if you take one string, let's say we take the open E string here, and let's use one finger to go all the way up to the 12th fret, which represents the octave of E. If we do that, and we play every single fret, here's open E, then we go up one at a time. This is the chromatic scale. We don't skip anything. In contrast to that, we have the major scale. If we did E major, it would look like on one string with one finger, just so we can really see it, open E, then we go up to F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, and then we're back. So we're purposely omitting certain notes and playing other ones. Chromatic scale doesn't discriminate, it plays all the notes. And you can pick any point in that scale, it really is infinite. I guess all scales are, but especially chromatic, you can choose different points to jump off from and go up and down in different ways. This is something Trey uses a ton in different songs like David Bowie, Gaiuti. There are tons of songs where he really makes beautiful use of the chromatic scale. Now let's look at two different ways, other than what I just did on the E string, to play this that I just personally enjoy these two different patterns, but there are tons of other ways you could do it. Let's go to the 5th fret of the G string with the index finger, and we're going to go like this. Down to the B string, same thing. Now we're going to shift over a fret to the left on the high E string, and then slide up to 8, then peel the fingers back, slide up to 9 on the B string, go backwards, then we'll be on 9 of G, and then we end up back where we started. On a side note, recently I uploaded a video that Trey did talking about some dexterity exercises, and in that video he just briefly mentions his approach to how he moves his hand around the fretboard, and he said something like, he tries to keep it basically this form, and it's just a matter of moving the hand without really changing from this any more than is needed. So not kind of wrangling the hand around or flying away any more than is needed. And so if you go to practice this chromatic scale that I just laid out, maybe think of it that way, where you're trying to keep this form and you maximize the frets you can play in that range, and then you slide over without changing form. You see, it's just the same form the fingers are making. Now here's another way we can practice the chromatic scale. This will be a little bit of a longer version, and it has this really cool kind of meandering diagonal form to it. So that is not only just really fun to play, but it's a good dexterity exercise. It's a good way to map out what the notes are that you're playing. Many benefits to that. Next, let's dive into chord inversions and see the role that they play throughout the verse. Okay, so now that we've looked at the chromatic scale, let's see how this ties into the next concept, which is chord inversions and what role they play in the verse. So a chord inversion is just taking any given set of notes that make up a chord, and what we do is, let's say we're playing a C major chord. The root position of C major is a C, then the major third is an E, followed by the fifth, which is a G. So the inversions are just taking those three notes as a set and then moving them around so that the C is no longer the root of the chord. It's not the lowest tone that we hear. So instead of it being C, E, G, we make it E, G, C. That's first inversion. Or second inversion is going G, C, E. So that's really it in a nutshell. Now you could have chords that have more tones to them, and then you have more inversions at your disposal. But one interesting thing is that depending on how many notes you have in the chord you're playing and how many inversions you end up doing, it becomes a matter of how you want to look at things. Chords can be very ambiguous and can look like one thing or another thing depending on your perspective. An example of that is what I was just talking about a moment ago with F sharp half diminished. Now, I don't even really, this is just me, I'm not saying this is right or wrong or anything, but my point of view here is I don't even really distinguish this too much from the D9 that I view it coming from and hear it coming from. I just think of that as, okay, that's the first inversion, because it's part of that set of notes. Now, let's look at the chord progression again and see what our inversions are. So here, the C that we start out with is really strong and it feels like home. And it's the key that we're playing in, the key of C. Even though sometimes we may have things that are out of key, we'll see that happen in a second. This is our home base, and it's really cool that we start out with a root position chord. It's just really strong, a sturdy foundation. Okay, now next up, then we have this G over B. Now anytime you see a chord written out and it says G/B, for example, that's how this would look. What that's saying is you're playing a G chord and you're putting that chord over the particular note that's indicated after that. So we're playing a G major chord but with a B on the bottom of it. That's what that means. And so if you look at the full form of where this is coming from, this would be like your C chord shape, kind of like down here. It looks a little different because we don't have open strings up here and we have to compensate for that. But this is the same kind of thing. So this is like a C major chord form, but it's really a G because we're up on the 10th fret of the A string. Now, instead of having the pinky finger play this G right here, we peel that away and don't play that string, or the top string for that matter. And what we're left with is a B, a D, and a G. And it makes total sense. Those are the three notes that we need to make up a G chord. It's just that we've shuffled up the order. And that's really it. So when you see one of those chords, again, that has a letter with a slash and then another letter, the first bit is saying what the chord is that you're really playing. The slash is saying then this is on top of this lower note, which in our case is a B. Okay, now the next one here, moving down our chromatic scale, the next note is B flat. Now B flat in this context represents the flat 7 of a C9 chord. All that means is that you're playing a C chord, which has the flattened 7th, and the 9th. Now the 9th, all that is the octave up from the 2nd degree of the scale that you're playing. So if you're playing in the key of C, the 2nd degree of C is a D, and the next octave up would make that a 9th. Because think about it, if 1 and 8 are the same, that's an octave, a C, and then you go up 8 steps in the scale, you get back to C. It follows that the 2nd tone, then it kind of goes up a little more. The 2nd tone becomes the 9th. And on that goes. So for our purposes, this B flat represents the flat 7 because that's its relationship to C. And we'll get more into the relationship between different notes in a little bit in the next section. So for now, this B flat is our lowest note, and we're playing a C9. So we've got a D in there, that's the 9th. We've got a G, that's the 5th. And then the E over here on the open E string is the major 3rd. Now, we're not playing the root here in this chord. So, it is an interesting thing. This is kind of what I was talking about with the ambiguity of chords. Do you see this as a C9 over B flat, or do you choose to see this as a G minor 6 over B flat? It's really up to you. I'm thinking of this, though, as a C9 over B flat, and the reason that I'm orienting myself that way to look at it like that is because the chord that directly follows this is an F major chord, and so it makes logical sense to me that you would have a C9 chord or a C7 chord, a version of a dominant chord. That C is the 5th of F, and so it's just leading your ear to the next chord. This is called tonicizing, and so we're tricking the ear into thinking we're changing keys for a moment. Now moving on, we go to F over A, or F major 7, I should say, over A. Now, the reason for that is if we look at this chord shape, it's the same thing we did for the G over B a little earlier. It's just a whole step down. And the fact that we keep this open E string in here makes it a major 7th because E is the major 7th of F. And again, that'll tie into knowing each note's intervallic relationship to each other note. Okay, so we have this C shape would be our root position, but again, we're not actually using the pinky finger, so the next note is the major 3rd, which is A. Then there's a C after that, which is the 5th of F. Then we have an F and an E. And that particular tension there is really cool, having those notes next to each other. This is an F major 7 over A. Again, the F major 7 represents the F major 7 chord, and the slash says, okay, we're putting that over the bass note A, and that's what we have. Okay, now, next up, this one is F minor major 7 over A flat. Now, if this was F major 7 over an A, it follows that if we flatten the third, because we established this A is the major third of F, then we're playing the minor third of F, but we still have an E in there, so it's an F minor major 7, and we're doing that over the A flat. And it's got that beautiful tension between these two notes, but now we have even more tension because it's a minor chord. At this point, you may be thinking to yourself, well, how on earth does this fit into the key of C? My point of view on an F minor major 7 is that's perfectly in the key of C because I work out of the 6th diminished scale, like I mentioned earlier, and I always include the note that is between the 5th and the 6th of every key. So no matter what key I'm playing in, I include that in sort of the basket of notes that I am considering if I'm improvising or playing a song. In our case here, that A flat could also be called G sharp, and so if you think of the key of C, there's that note that we're using as the bass. So the implication of that is that the 4th degree of any key you're playing in, or if we're in the key of C, the 4th degree would be an F. It could be an F major 7. You could choose to play that voicing. But now that we have access to this G sharp or A flat, now we can also have access to an F minor major 7 like we have here. Again, I'm not so much saying that's how it is or that that's right or anything. That's just how I look at it. So take that with a grain of salt. I'm sure there are going to be many people with different points of view and maybe even feel like that's totally wrong. That's cool. I totally get that. It's kind of choose your own adventure kind of thing. Now, after this chord, now the chromatic movement goes down again and we're playing a G, but this time we're playing a C over G. So the G that we're playing isn't representing a G major chord, but rather the C major that we started with, but now we've descended to the point where the lowest note is a G. It's the 5th. And it's cool, with these inversions, you'll find that you can wring so much more out of just a few chords. I mean, really, there's a lot of color and vibrancy that you can get out of changing up the voicing, changing if you're playing an inversion or a root voicing. Okay, so this is the C over G. The next step here is going to go down from that G to an F sharp. I was thinking of this as an F sharp half diminished, or a D9 over F sharp. You could just as easily call it that. This one here is 4th fret, and then we can bar the 5th fret. And that's a beautiful way to lead the ear back up a semitone for our last little chromatic movement here for a while, up to a G major 9. Now G major 9 just simply means we're playing a G major and putting a 9th. And again, from our example earlier, in the key of G, A is the 2nd, and so if we go up an octave, A is the 9th, and that's exactly what we're adding here on the 5th fret of the high E string to our G chord. And that's a really pretty chord. It's simple and beautiful. Now, the cool thing is, what we do here is instead of going in a chromatic fashion down from here, we're going to stay with the key of C, or the typical notes we might think of in the key of C. And now our G chord, remember that G is the 5th of C, and so it's dominant, or it's the Mixolydian mode. And so now we're going to put that G9 chord over F. Notice that the first one was G major 9, because we have to distinguish between a 9th chord and a major 9th chord. The major 9th chord does not have the dominant 7. The 9th chord does. The flat 7 is F, and that's actually what we're putting the chord over. Okay, so there's that one. And this leads us beautifully to an E7 sus 4 chord that we've seen before. Again, this may be a point where we ask ourselves, what on earth does an E7 sus 4 have to do with the key of C? It depends on who you ask. Again, if you ask me, I would say that's perfectly accountable in the key of C because, again, I'm working from the 6th diminished scale, In typical harmony, the third degree, Phrygian mode, would be a minor chord or a minor seventh chord or a minor with a flat 9. There are a lot of different ways you could do it. But since we're including that note between the 5th and the 6th degree, so in our case it's a G sharp, that makes our E a major chord. Now, it's sus for now because there's an A, that's in the key of C, so no problem there. And then we come down here, and that's when we have that tension release, and then we're going to go right back to tension and play an F diminished. Now again, you may ask yourself, what does that have to do with the key of C? But just the same way, if we look at all the notes that are there, there's an F, that's in the key of C. There's a B, that's in the key of C. There's a D, so is that. Here's our G sharp, which is from the 6th diminished scale, so everything's cool. Then we move up by a minor third. We have G sharp diminished. That's just the same 4 notes reordered. And then we go up to B diminished. And again, that's just the same 4 notes reordered. And we resolve back to C. Lastly, we'll start to broach the topic of knowing each note's intervallic relationship to all other notes. Now, what I mean by this is if we take the key of C, for example, that's the key we've been mostly working out of, and we give each note in the scale a number, we get C is 1, it's the first, D is the second, E is the third, the major third, F is the fourth, G is the fifth, A is the sixth, and B is the seventh, and then C, the 8th note, there is the octave. It's the same as the first one. So you could say that D is the 2nd of C, E is the 3rd of C, F is the 4th of C, G is the 5th of C, A is the 6th of C, B is the major 7th of C, and then C is the octave. Okay, now, instead of moving notes and looking at one scale like that, one key, what we're going to do here is think of, we'll take one note, C for example, and then we're going to do a chromatic scale going backwards, and from that we can see how C relates to all the other notes. So instead of moving our notes and looking at which number they are, we're going to keep the home base and move the key that it's relating to. Okay, so here's a C on the 10th fret of D. That's the 1 of C. If we move backwards 1, we could say, okay, we've got this B here. How would the C relate to that note? And you could say that that's the flat 2 of B. Because normally in the key of B, you would go B, C sharp. That would be the 2nd. So the flat 2nd is C natural. Now we're going to go back chromatically 1 fret, and we're on a B flat. And then we'd say, well, what is C in comparison to a B flat? In the key of B flat, C is the 2nd. Okay, so it's the flat 2 of B, and it's the 2nd of B flat. Now if we go back one more, then we're on an A. Okay, now A and C have a relationship. What is it? Well, we could say that C is the minor third of A because it's 3 semitones up. That is what we call that interval, that space is a minor third. So C is the minor third of A. Now let's go chromatically back another one. Here's A flat. C has a relationship with A flat like every other note, and it's this. It's the major third. Here's an A flat, here's our C, and that would be like the 2nd note in an A flat triad. The next note would be an E flat. So C's relationship to A flat is its major third. Now we'll go back 1, and we're on G. Well, C is the 4th of G. You can hear it. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the 4th. Now if we go back yet another one, then we would say that C is the flat 5 of G flat, or F sharp, depending on how you're looking at things. So normally it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That would be the 5th of G flat, but we're going to go back 1, and it's the flat 5. Now we'll keep going. let's see what C's relationship is to F. Well, if we count that up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the fifth of F. And we go down another one and we have E. Okay, so what is the relationship here? Well, C is the minor 6 of E. Because in the key of E, you would have E, F sharp, G sharp, A, B, C sharp is the 6th, and so that would be the flat 6. Now moving on, for E flat, what is its relationship to C? Well, if we look at it, C is the major 6th of E flat. If you do an E flat major scale, you would go E flat, F, you have G, A flat, B flat, C would be the 6th note in that scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, a couple more to go. Now D, I'm going to put D up here for a moment. And then here's our C that we started with. We're just kind of comparing everything to its relationship with this note here. We can see that C, if we're in the key of D, or thinking of D, the note D, C is a whole step down. You could call that a flattened 7th. C is the flat 7 of D. That would be in the key of G, you would have a D mixolydian. It would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And there's your C. It's the flattened 7th. Okay, now one more to go. In the key of D flat, then you would say C is the major 7th of D flat. Because if we play a D flat major scale, you would have, there's the 7th, and then there's D flat. Now, that may seem like a lot, and it very well could be if that's a really new way to look at things. But with time, if you just keep, thinking about it and practicing that, hopefully we'll know what every note is in relationship to every other note. Now, I just took C as an example. The idea would be that you would be able to, and everybody's going to have their own pace and their own goal with this, but for example, to say, okay, well, let me see if I can do the same thing with A. Okay, what is A to A? It's the first. What is A to A flat? It's the flat 2, and so on. Hopefully, we can do that at some point with every single note, know how it relates to all other notes. And now, this is where it'll tie into the verse of Lizards. We started off with this look at the chromatic scale, starting from C, and we go down to there, okay? Now we say, how do we get this to make sense? Well, C, which is the first bass note that we play, first root note, C is the 1 of C. Then the B, how does that fit into the G chord that we're playing? Well, that's B is the 3rd of G. The B flat is the flattened 7th of a C9. That's why we call it C9 over B flat. Then we have an F. But we're playing an A as the root note. So what is A's relationship to F? That is the major 3rd. Then we have an A flat. What's A flat's relationship to F? It's its minor 3rd, hence we get an F minor with this E on it. It makes it a minor major 7. Really tense chord. And then we're down to G, keeping our chromatic movement going. What is G's relationship to C? It's the 5th. Then we go down one more. For now, we'll just go down one more. And this one, depending on how you want to look at it, it can either be the root of a half diminished chord, which also could be called a minor 7 flat 5, or we could say, oh, that's the 3rd of a D, 9. Okay, so we can look at that many different ways. So hopefully now, by looking at the chromatic scale and the chromatic movement of this chord progression, and then considering chord inversions and how they work, we can make sense of why this is how it is in this verse. Why we're playing a C here, why we're playing a B here as the root, why we're playing a B flat, why there's an A flat, a G, an F sharp, and so on. Thank you so much for watching the lesson. I hope that you found something interesting or helpful in it, and I'll see you next time. Thanks so much.